You know, my very first memory of the war started not with us moving around, but waking up in an apartment that we were assigned in a Jewish yellow star house. And my very first memory was about pitch dark, 4 o'clock in the morning, 5 o'clock in the morning. Somebody was banging on the door, the front door, not banging, kicking it, and shouting. And then we heard a loudspeaker which said, "Everybody gather a day's food and clothing and come downstairs to the courtyard." Hungarian buildings have a courtyard, and when you come into the front gate or front door of the building, you can go upstairs by staircase or elevator, or you can continue straight and end up in a courtyard where people would have gatherings and whatever during the summer. So this wasn't summer. This was something like October, late October. And in Hungary, winter starts around the beginning of October, so it was very, very cold. And we were in an apartment without heat because it was wartime. It was 1944, October, and the Germans had just marched into Hungary about 6 months before that to occupy Hungary. So we were kind of captives. And here's this loudspeaker and kicking on the door. And my mother jumped out of bed. We were all in the same double bed, and said, let's get ready, let's get dressed, and let's go downstairs. And as she jumped out of bed, my sister jumped out of bed. I had a sister who was 3 years older than me. I was 4 years old and she was 7. And she grabbed my mother's legs and said, "We're not going." And my mother said, "What are you talking about? Get dressed." And she said, "We're not going." And all this time, there's this tremendous kicking at the door and somebody shouting outside the door, "Downstairs, downstairs, get dressed, go downstairs." And there they are. I just covered up my face and I thought, I don't want to know what they're doing. And after a while my sister and my mother are struggling in the middle of the bedroom, the kicking of the door stops and they freeze. And we hear steps from downstairs. There's a loudspeaker who says, "Keep moving, keep moving." And we hear shuffling steps. And within a few minutes, there is this dead silence in the building. I've never in my life heard such silence, except maybe later on in the desert or on a hilltop. But this was like sort of a blank. And my mother said, "They're gone." And then she looked at the clock and said, "It's too early to do anything else. Let's go back to bed. We'll sleep a couple of hours." So we went back to bed and she woke us up around, must have been, I don't know, 6:37 in the morning, and said, "Now we're going to get dressed and we're going to take some things with us and we have to leave the building because everybody else had left, and if they find us, we're in trouble." So we did what she said, and she served us some hot coffee and a piece of bread in the kitchen, and she gathered whatever food we had, a couple of pieces of cheese and bread that was standard Hungarian food, and salami, and she put, we had little briefcases, and she put our stuff in our briefcases and food stuff and her stuff into hers, and we walked toward the front door to leave, and all of a sudden this door had like a glass window, and all of a sudden there was a shadow on the window and there was somebody knocking on the front door, and we froze. And then we heard this voice which said, "Mrs. Fabian, don't be scared, I am your neighbor, and open the door, I'm going to talk to you." And we thought, wow, there's somebody else in the building. So my mother opened the door, and there was this little old man, at least to me he was very old, I was 4 years old, so everybody looked old who was an adult. And he said to my mother, "Do you know where you're going?" He said, "I was the one who told the Nazis that you had left already. That's why they stopped kicking on your door." So he saved our lives. Then when he saw our cases ready to go somewhere, he said, "You know where to go?" And my mother said, "No, but we know we have to leave the building." So he said, "There's a new safe house, Swedish safe house, that just opened up by the Danube." And he gave my mother the address. And it wasn't very far, it was like walking distance, half an hour. And he said, "If you let me have the keys to your apartment, I'll save it for you till you can come back." And my mother thanked him profusely. And I saw that she had taken something out of her purse and stuck it in her pocket. And we went downstairs, and downstairs on the right-hand side of every Hungarian building, or as you walk in on the left-hand side usually, there's an apartment for the concierge who locks the gate at night, opens the gate in the morning so people could come and go, but keeps the building actually, locked up overnight. And you have to knock on his door to be let out. Well, at this point, my mother had to knock on his door. I guess it must have been before 7 o'clock. So she knocked on the door. Concierge came out and said, "Mrs. Fabian," and saw us and said, "You're still here." And my mother said, "We're leaving now." And she extended her hand, and they shook hands. And I figured out, young as I was, that she must have given him some money with the handshake, the money that she stuck in her pocket previously. And sure enough, he opened the gate for us, and we left. Except it was absolutely freezing cold outside. Um, what I didn't do is that when I started to tell you the story is, I didn't show you where Hungary is. So why don't we have the first map up, if you can? And I wanted to show you where Hungary is located, because it is a country that's located smack in the middle of Europe. There. You see Slovakia very big above, and then you see Hungary right here. Can we have the next picture? And it is surrounded by other countries. Here's a bigger picture of Europe. And as you can see, Germany is here, Austria is here, and Hungary is here. And Hungary had been occupied, sort of, ruled by the Austrian royal family. It was called Austro-Hungary. And when the Germans marched into Austria, they could also very easily march into Hungary. So, next picture, please. Um, Above, down, yeah. This is just so fun. I'm going to show you something. This is at age like 2 or 3, and I was with my grandparents in a small town called Debrecen. We were visiting. Next picture, please. This is when I was very young, maybe 1 year old, and my sister Judith, if I was 1, she was 4, and she had a favorite Hungarian doll that she always played with. Next picture, please. This is after the war. Clearly we survived, or I wouldn't be telling you the story. And this is me over here, maybe at age 6 or 7. And this is my sister, 3 years older, so she's like 9 or 10. And I think the last picture, yeah, this is around the same period, because I don't have any front teeth, so I must have been 6. Okay, we can go back to me. Anyway, so here we were outside that building, and it started to snow, so it was really cold. And as we start walking, my mother says, "I have to make a call." and we stopped at a phone booth. In Hungary, phone booths were like little glass booths, and you stepped in and you could be seen from the outside. So my sister and I were standing outside in the snow, and she was making a call. The call was made. Oops, I thought I had shut my phone down. I'm sorry. I'll ignore it. Um, the call was, there's a call. The call was made to my mother's best friend because my mother's best friend was supposed to come to our house that day, to our apartment, and stay with us while my mother was going to travel to a Hungarian village way up in northern Hungary to pick up some false birth certificates, not false, real birth certificates that were of a Christian family. So we would have legitimate Christian birth certificates for my mother, my sister, myself, and even for her friend Irene. So we could stay in the city hiding in the open as Christians. What happened during the war was, I'm sure you heard this by now, so I don't know if I really need to elaborate on this, is that there was a Swedish diplomat, Paul Wallenberg, who worked at the Swedish embassy in Budapest, and he had bought a number of buildings and private villas and declared them Swedish property and issued what was called a Swedish pass. I don't know what it's called. I still know only the German word for it, which is Schutzpass. And anybody who had this could live in one of those buildings under the protection of the Swedish government. And this is what we had at the moment, and this is where we were heading, to the Swedish safe house. Except that wasn't in the plans. In the plans was that my mother's friend was coming to stay with us where we had been in our apartment. So now my mother had to call her friend Irene. Hopefully, she had not been collected by the Nazis, and tell her to meet us at the Swedish safe house down by the Danube. She actually reached Irene and gave Irene the address and said, "Don't ask any questions, bring some food, come there." So we walked to the Swedish safe house in the increasingly heavy snowfall, very cold. And when we got there, my mother presented our Swedish safe passes, and the concierge said, "It's early, you're the first ones, go right upstairs." My mother said, "No, we'll wait here because I'm waiting for a friend who will stay with us." So we sat down on a little bench across from the concierge's apartment and waited for Irene. And I was very bored, I was a very restless, active child. So my sister, to keep me quiet, started telling me fairy tales. And there we sat, and I was listening to her telling me a story. Irene finally arrived, checked in, and we went upstairs. Now, upstairs was this huge room, the first floor. This was like a two-story building, so presumably the bedrooms were upstairs. But downstairs was a hallway with a bathroom and this really big room like a ballroom. And Irene said, "Oh, look, what a nice big room. Let's just find a place by the wall and let's sit down and settle in." And my mother said, "No, no, wait." She saw a door at the far end of the room to our right as we were facing the room. She went over there, and it was like a pantry, really small, but enough for us to be able to settle in there. And what it had, which was the most important aspect of it, was a window to the outside and a sink with running water. And my mother said, "This is where we're staying." And Irene said, "Why, look at this huge room." And my mother said, "Wait." And we all went in and settled in this tiny room on the floor. There was nothing else. And by the afternoon, the big room next door to us was so full of refugees, Hungarian Jews, maybe some gypsies, I don't know, who there was no place to walk. When we had to go to the bathroom and walk through that big room, we had to be very careful not to step on people. There were old people, young people, babies crying, infants. It was really crowded, so we were very comfortable in our small room and grateful to my mother for her foresight. Also, we got hungry around early afternoon, which was the usual lunchtime in Hungary. And Irene said, look what I brought. Well, in her briefcase, she had packed it with the food that she had, which was the same kind of food we had: salami, bread, cheese, and we had running water. So we were quite comfortable. And my mother said, you know, if this is working out, I'll leave you here with the kids. You can stay a couple of days without me, and I'll go get our papers. So it was all set, except that night, again, 4 o'clock in the morning or sometime at that point, pitch dark outside, we hear a loudspeaker next door. Everybody hand over your safe passes, hand over your safe passes. And my mother said, we're not doing that. She always carried a notebook with her, so she tore off some pieces of paper and kind of made them the size of safe passes, kind of folded it up, and said, this is what we're handing over. It's dark. They're not going to look at it till later. So when they knocked on the door and shouted, safe passes, my mother reached out, handed them over, closed the door. And then she said, we're going to have to leave here, because when they look at the safe passes and figure out that 4 of them are just pieces of paper, they're going to figure out who is missing, whose name is missing from the list, and they're going to arrest us. So let's sleep a couple of hours and then we leave. We woke up. It was still dark, probably around 6 o'clock in the morning, 7 o'clock. And we each had a piece of bread and a piece of cheese and water from the sink. And then packed our stuff together and left the room and had to walk very, very carefully through all these sleeping bodies on the floor. And me, being 4 years old and kind of mischievous, I almost stepped on somebody's hand and I started to giggle. And my sister pinched me and said, shut up or I'll hit you. And I was more afraid of my sister than my mother, so I very quickly turned quiet. We walked through the room, went downstairs, and again I saw my mother knock on the door of the concierge with something in her hand. It was obviously money. And the concierge came out, woken up very, he said, Mrs. Fabian, what are you doing here? And she said, we have to leave. And please open the gate for us. And she extended her hand. And the man shook her hand and went to open the door without, the gate actually, without any further comment. So here we were out on the street again. Must have been about 7 o'clock, because we knew that, my mother knew that streetcars and buses were running already. And she said, I don't know where we're going, but we have to figure this one out. So we stood there for a while, and then she suddenly said, oh, I have an idea. We have to take a streetcar, and then we're going to have to take a bus across the bridge on the Danube, the Margaret Bridge, and I know where we're going. Instead of snowing, now it started to rain. It was very uncomfortable. And we took a bus, we took a streetcar, then we took a bus across the bridge. We got off the bridge, and then the rain turned into snow again. It was very, very cold. and early in the morning, and we started to climb one of the hills on the Buda side. The city of Budapest is actually two cities. Pest is the flat side where most of the people live and all the industries are and all the offices. Buda is a hilly side where all the elegant villas were and all the well-to-do or rich people lived in the hills in beautiful, beautiful villas and homes. So we're heading up to one of these villas, and we're climbing and climbing, and it was very slippery in the snow. I remember how difficult it was, but my mother just sort of dragged me along, and finally we reach an iron gate, very beautiful villa behind it, and my mother rings the bell. And a few minutes later, this man comes out in his morning robe and pajamas and looks at us and then recognizes my mother and says, "Mrs. Fabian, what are you doing here?" And of course, he sees us. He says, "Come in, come in." So he opens the gate. We go inside, and his wife, as soon as she sees us, starts preparing food in the kitchen, which is a very Hungarian custom that when people come to your house, you immediately serve them something, whether it's a piece of cake or a sandwich or whatever. So we settled in the kitchen, and my mother told this man what happened. This man happened to be a doctor who was head of his own department, a surgeon, and he and my father were rowing partners in a very elegant rowing sports club in the city. They used to row from Budapest to Vienna, which is a 3-hour drive if you're going by car. So you can imagine how good an athlete you had to be to actually row to Vienna and then row back, probably about 6 hours each way. I don't know. But anyway, he was a close friend to my father. And now my father had disappeared like the year before. He didn't exactly disappear. He was um, collected to work in a labor camp on the eastern front of Hungary. Many Jews had been collected to be part of the army as forced labor camp workers. So that's where my father had gone, and we never heard from him again. We didn't know where he was. We figured he's working somewhere and he'll come back. But in the meantime, we had to survive. So my mother explained our dilemma that she had to go and pick up these Christian papers and didn't know what to do with us. And the doctor looked at us and said, "You know, you can't stay here because in an hour a maid is coming and we can't trust her. If a Christian person was hiding anybody Jewish, both the Jews and the Christians were taken to a concentration camp or a work camp, so he couldn't hide us. He couldn't trust his maid. So he said, while you're away, Irene can come with me to the hospital and work there as a cleanup person or whatever. But the children, you'd have to take them to the Red Cross building, which is in the center of Budapest. And they'll be safe there as long as they can pretend to be sick." And that was very easy. My sister had a cold, and I had two talents. I could have a cold at will, and I could also throw up at will, which I used to use when I wanted something from my mother. I would say to her, "I'm going to faint if you don't give it to me." And I would faint. I could hold my breath and I could faint. So either one of those will do, he said, the doctor said. And so after breakfast, we were about to leave when he said, "Where are you going to go after you have the papers?" And his wife said, "You know, my brother is away and he has an apartment. He took his family. He's on the front, fighting actually. They were Christian. And his family went to live in the village or the small town where they come from. So he has an empty apartment, and the district that this apartment was in was at the far end of the city, and nobody would know us there. So she said, "We have the key to his apartment, and I can give that to you." And then she realized we couldn't go there until my mother came back from the village where she had to go to pick up the papers. And that is why Irene had to go with the doctor to the hospital, and we had to hide for a couple of days among sick children in the Red Cross hospital because we still had only the Jewish papers and the Swedish safe pass. So we thanked the doctor who told us we had to leave at that point. Irene was staying there till he was ready to go to the hospital. And my mother took my sister and me to the Red Cross hospital across the city again in the snow and cold. And, you know, this is why I live in California. I hate snow. Anyway, um, we got to the Red Cross building, and they looked at us, and my sister was coughing and I was coughing, and they said, "Okay, go upstairs." The doctor gave my mother a certificate that said we were under observation for uh, pulmonary disease or pneumonia or something. So they took us upstairs with this paper. And my mother left and said she will be back the next evening, the next day in the evening, or the following day in the morning. So we went upstairs and we were put to bed next to each other, these narrow kids' hospital beds. And the nurse said to us, "Don't take your clothes off, only your shoes. Put your shoes under the bed because we don't have any heat and you'll be cold." And she gave each of us a very thin blanket and a pillow and said, "Just lie down and, we'll take care of you." So we did what she said and looked around, and this was a huge room again, lined with beds on two sides of the wall, and there was like a passage in the middle so the nurses could bring us food or the doctors could come in and check on us. So we got into bed and put our little briefcases also under the bed and lay down, and then I said to my sister, "I am really bored. Can I sing? Can I do something?" She said, "No, of course you can't sing. Come here, I'll tell you a story." So I crawled into bed with her, and as she started to tell me a story, other kids who weren't that sick got out of their bed, came over to us, sat on my bed or on the floor, and listened to the story. So when the nurses came in, they found us sitting there listening to a story. They told us to go back to bed, everybody. The doctors checked on us. They brought us lunch. And the lunch consisted of a very thin soup, very typical Hungarian soup, caraway soup, just made with fried flour and caraway seeds boiled together, and a piece of bread. That was it. There was no food anywhere in the city because we were under siege, basically, both by the Russians and the Germans fighting back. So we had our soup, we had our bread, then the doctors came in to check on us again, and then we were supposed to take a nap. And after everybody took a nap, including us, my sister again told me some stories to keep me quiet. And then we had dinner, and then we went to sleep. And the next morning, the same thing. We had soup and bread for breakfast. We had soup and bread for lunch. And my sister continued the stories. And by evening, I just before going to sleep, I said to my sister, you know, uh, it doesn't look like Mommy will come back. Do you think she'll be back tomorrow? And my sister said, I don't know. I hope so. Probably. She's very clever. She'll be back. Now go to sleep. She didn't tell me she was just as worried as I was that my mother may not be able to come back or whatever. But we went to sleep. And that night, it was still dark. Must have been about 5 o'clock in the morning when the nurses came in bringing us hot soup and a piece of bread and saying, get up, everybody wake up, have your breakfast, put your shoes on, put your coat on, and after breakfast you have to come downstairs. No matter how sick the children were, and some were really sick, and there was an age range of like from 1 or 2 years old to 12 or 13, and there was nothing we could do except follow orders. But when we were drinking our soup, my sister said to me, you know what? Let's share my bread. Let's put your bread in your briefcase because we don't know where they're taking us and we might need to have some food. So before leaving the bedroom or the sick room, we did that. And we went downstairs and we were told to go outside and line up outside the building. This was a very long, very big building, and alongside the building, we were told to line up by twos. So my sister and me were standing in a row of kids, and there were officers, Nazi officers in their black uniforms and black boots, every few steps of the way, telling us to line up and keep quiet. And my sister insisted, of course, that we bring our briefcases with us. So there we are. Nobody else had anything to carry except us. And when everybody seemed to be out of the building, we were told to start walking. And it was still dark. Now, because it was winter, in Hungary, when it's winter, the light, actually, the sun doesn't show or doesn't come up until about 10, 11 o'clock in the morning, and it goes down around 2 or 3 in the afternoon. So we started to walk in pitch dark, and we were guided by the officers, and we were walking across the city. And it being winter, it started to rain again. So we're walking in the rain. It was very slippery, and we're getting wetter and wetter. And I was hoping you would stop at some point because I was getting really tired, and we wouldn't stop. And there were some kids in front of us or behind us who kind of fell out of line and sat down by the wall. And who knows what happened to them? They probably got shot at the end of the line. But we were told to keep marching. And I was so exhausted after several hours of marching like that I said to my sister, I can't carry my briefcase anymore. I want to put it down. She said, no, give it to me. So she carried it for a while. And just, I mean, this went on all day long. And the sun came up and the sun went down again. And it was kind of like, not, the sun didn't really come up because it was raining, but it was light. And then it got dark again. So we knew it must have been like 3, 4 o'clock in the afternoon by then. And finally, when not only us, but the other kids were just about ready to collapse, we came to a very large building, and the gates were open, and we were told to go inside. There was an office as we entered with a big desk where a man sat, and behind him, or to the one side of him, was another very big door. And they opened this door and they told us to go into this room. We went into the room. It was full, absolutely full with children already sitting there on the floor. And there was no room to walk around anywhere, but we had a large group of kids coming in. So my sister grabbed my arm and said, "Come, I'll find us a place." And she did, right in the back of the room, just telling kids to move, move, move. And finally, she made room for us at the back wall of this huge building. And soon after we all settled in, um, there was an announcement that we were not going to get any food, but we'll get breakfast in the morning. And of course, we were getting very hungry. And my sister whispered to me, "Wait till it gets really dark and everybody falls asleep, then we'll eat our bread." So we also kind of dozed off and leaning against the wall and using our briefcases kind of to lean on. And then we both woke up. It was like everybody was asleep. The room was very quiet. And my sister said, "Okay, now we can eat our bread." So at least we had something in our stomachs that night. And we fell asleep again. And very early, it was still very dark in the room and everybody was sleeping. Um, the door opened and a man in a Nazi uniform stood there and shouted into the room, "Judith and Erika Fabian, come here." And he shouted it loud enough and several times. So hearing our names, we woke up. I'm a very light sleeper, and so was my sister. So we heard our name, we woke up, and I whispered to my sister, "He's wearing a Nazi uniform. He's asking us to come out and to kill us." And my sister said, "Don't be stupid. He knows our names. Get up, let's go." So we crawled across the room and went over to this young Nazi and said, my sister said, "I'm Judith, this is Erika Fabian." He said, "Don't say a word, come with me." So he took us outside to this big desk just outside the room and said, "These kids had been taken here by mistake. Here are their papers." And he showed the guard some paperwork, and the guard said he could care less. It was dawn. He said, "Okay, sign for them here." So he signed for us and said, "Let's go." And he helped us carry our briefcases as we went outside. And he said, "We're going to take some streetcars. I don't want you to talk at all. Just come with me." And he helped us actually. He walked with us. He told us to hold on to his arms so that we could walk easier. We got on a streetcar. We got on another streetcar. And I could see why he said we shouldn't talk, because besides people on the streetcar who were going to work and to market and who knows what, there were also a lot of men dressed as in Nazi uniforms. So we knew that it would be dangerous for us to make a sound. And after a while, we got off one streetcar, another streetcar, third streetcar. We got off and walked for quite a while. And we had no idea where we were going, and we were afraid to ask. So it was kind of a very scary experience. And then he took us into a building and knocked on the concierge's door and opened the door, and my mother was there. It was probably one of the most, it always makes me cry when I think of it. Even now, I mean, I just, it brings up the memory of her hugging us. And what really happened was, excuse me, this young Nazi officer wasn't a Nazi at all. This is what happened. My mother actually got back that morning, the early morning of the morning that we were taken away that day. And she went to the Red Cross building and saw two Nazi officers standing by the door, by the gate, and knew that something was wrong. And of course they spotted her, and she went over to them and she said, "What's this building?" And they said, "Are you looking for a child in here? This is the Red Cross hospital." But all those Jewish brats had been taken away this morning to another place. And my mother knew immediately that we were in big trouble. And she said, she was very quick to think on her feet. She said, "No, no, no, this is the wrong building. I'm looking for another building." And they said, "Can we help you?" And my mother, being very sensitive to her stomach, threw up. She was that scared. And they said, "Oh, are you sick?" And she said, "No, no, no. I'm my husband is at the front and I'm pregnant." And they were very embarrassed because in Hungary in 1944 you didn't tell young men that you were pregnant. She didn't show it, obviously. She wasn't pregnant. So they said, "Can we take you somewhere? Can we help you?" She said, "No, no, no, I'll be fine." So she collected herself and left. She didn't go home. She went straight to the hospital to see the doctor. And he had just come out of surgery, so she was in luck. Took her into his office and she told him what happened. And he said, "I think I know what to do." He had some connections in the Jewish underground. There was a very big Jewish underground. In fact, I later learned I had an uncle who worked for the Jewish underground, and he contacted them, and they figured out where we had been taken. So this took a while. And then the doctor had a couple of Jewish doctors working for him under disguise and false papers. And these Jewish doctors, with the help of the underground, got one of them got a Nazi uniform that he could put on and came to get us. So this is how they were able to rescue us. Now, my mother thanked this man, obviously, and he left. And she said, "Before we go upstairs to our apartment, I want you to learn your new names." So she grilled us. My name remained Erika because it was a good German name as well as a Swedish name. And instead of Fabian, which is kind of a Hungarian Jewish name, my last name became Polyak. And my sister's name was changed from Judith, which was kind of a Jewish name, to Edith Polyak. And not only that, but I don't know why, I never asked her afterwards, she made us learn the Christian version of the Lord's Prayer. We had actually Protestant birth certificates. That's because in that village, my mother had a maid who lived with us from the time we were born. And when the laws came out that Christians couldn't work for Jews, she had to leave. So she knew us very well. And she said to my mother at that time, "If you need anything, let me know." So when my father was taken into forced labor camp and disappeared, my mother wrote to this maid in her village. And the maid wrote back and said, "If you can send me money, I can get you birth certificates that correspond pretty much to your ages." So this is why my mother had to go to that village to collect the birth certificates. And my father had a wholesale hardware business, and we were extremely well-to-do before the war. So my mother could spend the money on getting birth certificates and anything else we needed. So that wasn't the problem. The problem was to survive as human beings. So once we learned the Lord's Prayer, she took us upstairs to the apartment of the doctor's wife's brother. And it was a wonderful apartment. Sort of, it had a kitchen and a bedroom, and a, a small living room or something like that. And Irene was there. So we were pretty safe, I should say, because what time is it? Okay, because we had the Christian papers and we knew our Christian names. There were other kids in the building, and we met them and we played with them. And it was like the difficulties that we experience of no food and air raids very often were the same as anybody else in Hungary or in Budapest, except around December, the air raids were much heavier, and people were instructed to go down to the basement of the building, which was supposed to be the bomb shelter. My mother was afraid that if we went down there, somebody would ask me a question about not only where we came from, we were supposed to be refugees from that particular village in Hungary, but that I would give away somehow that we were Jewish. So we didn't go down to the basement. And finally, when the building next door to us was bombed and collapsed, that night, as we were in bed, I said to my mother, you know, I know you and Judith are praying every night in Hebrew. I haven't given us away. I know we're supposed to be Christians. Please let's go to the basement so we don't die up here. And my mother listened to me, so we went down to the basement. And the basement was an L-shaped uh, underground situation. And along the walls were chairs set up for people to sit on and little cots that people brought down with them to lie down during the night. Well, me being me and 4 years old, I was very bored. So during the day when there was no bombing, instead of sitting still next to my mother, I would go down this corridor along in the middle of the shelter and sing and dance. I had gone to nursery at age 3, so I learned some songs and I invented dances, Hungarian dances, which I don't know if you're born with it, I think. I might have learned them at nursing school. So I would run around and dance and sing and entertain people. And they thought I was very cute. So they would give me something. They would give me a carrot. They would give me a piece of bread or whatever because they liked me. They liked the entertainment. So I would collect these and take them over to my mother and say, I'm earning the bread for the family now. And around Christmas, I don't know how, suddenly people were able to get flour and sugar and started baking. My mother was also baking cookies. And one day we were down in the basement and I had just finished dancing and singing, and this woman sitting next to my mother called me over and showed me a cookie that she was going to give me, and she said, does your mother make these kinds of cookies for Christmas? And I saw my mother's face. She froze because what she expected me to say was, we're Jewish, we don't have Christmas, we don't make cookies like that. Instead, I said to the woman, in the village where we lived or where we come from, they don't make these kinds of cookies. And to this day, I could see my mother's face relax as she took a deep breath. And the woman gave me a couple of cookies for us. So after the war was over, um, we survived, and the Russian tanks were rolling into the city, and my mother bought a Russian dictionary, and we learned some Russian words like chleb, which means bread, and sugar, and I forgot what else. But I was very quick to learn about 10 Russian words, please and thank you. And we would leave the building, my mother and I, my sister stayed in, she didn't like going out. And I would go over to these Russian tanks where Russian soldiers would stand and give candy to kids. And I would say hello to them and I would say bread, and they would reach into their pockets and give me not maybe a loaf, but like the corner of a loaf of bread or whatever. And once again, I said, I'm earning the food for the family. After the war, things settled down in Hungary, except my mother found out that my father wasn't coming back. So she realized that she had to get some work somewhere. She had to do something to earn a living. So she could not take care of our family. Nobody in our family came back. So she took my sister and me to a Jewish orphanage that was actually run by a Zionist organization, and said, I'm very sorry, but you have to live here until I find us a place, maybe we can go back to our old house. I don't know, old apartment, but we settle in, until I know what to do. So we were staying at this orphanage, and because it was run by Zionists, they taught us Hebrew and Hebrew songs and Hebrew holidays, Jewish holidays. And except for the fact that I was missing my mother, I was having fun, and my sister was quite all right. She made friends there, and I made friends there. And then one day, and periodically we were able to visit my mother, who was living in our old apartment.
Erika, 8 minutes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
And she said to us, now you're going to have to change change institutions, because the Zionists were in 1948 rejected by the Hungarian government. So we went to a different orphanage, which was a terrible, terrible place. And what saved me there was that they allowed me to read books. I learned to read when I was 3 years old, because my sister had a tutor at age 6, and I sat in on her sessions. So I was reading a couple of books a week. And then in 1948, my mother remarried and had a home again. And so we went to live with her and my stepfather. I just want to say that in 1952, we tried to escape from Hungary, were arrested, and spent a year. My mother spent a year in jail. My sister and I were taken by the same uncle who worked for the underground in Hungary at that time. We tried to escape through Czechoslovakia. So we were arrested in the capital of Slovakia, Bratislava, and my mother was in jail, my sister was in jail, I was in a children's police institute. And this same uncle, who was a journalist actually, had been working in Prague, and my mother sent him a postcard saying, can you help us? He came, and with his connections as a journalist, took my sister out of jail, took me out of children's prison, and took us to Prague. By this time, I had been in jail 8 months, so I spoke fluent Slovak. Now I learned fluent Czech and went to school from September to December. That year, Stalin, the dictator of Russia, died, so things became a little easier in the communist government. And by the time we were taken back to Hungary in the winter, January of 1954, they decided that my mother and my sister had served enough jail sentence for escaping. We could all go home to my stepfather, who had not escaped with us, because he said, in case we get arrested, he had foresight, we could have a home to go home to if we got arrested. So that's what happened. 2 years later, in 1956, the Hungarian Revolution happened, and we escaped again. And by this time, I had an uncle who was living as a rabbi in Dover, Delaware, and he sponsored us to come to America. So I came to America in the winter, just before New Year's in 1956. And I began a whole new life. I went to high school in America. I went to college. I got married when I was 20, and my husband decided to take a Fulbright grant in Peru, so I lived 2 years in Peru. Then we came back to America. I finished college at Northwestern University in the theater department. We moved to San Francisco, where I opened my own acting school. 3 years later, we moved to Mexico because my husband took a job in Mexico. He was a pharmaceutical chemist. And somewhere in between, I had my first child in Peru, and we had a nanny so I could go back to school. And I had my second child in San Francisco. And with all this travel, our children, of course, were with us. We lived in Mexico about 10 years. And then I met a National Geographic photographer who happened to be of Hungarian origin. And by this time, my marriage was kind of falling apart because I was an artist, my husband was a chemist. So we kind of grew apart. We stayed very friendly, but we grew apart. So we decided to separate. And I started to work with this Hungarian National Geographic photographer as his interpreter because he got an assignment in Hungary. So I had a chance to go back to Hungary as an adult and see the country, and I loved the work. So I left theater and I became a world traveling writer and photographer. I had always been writing stories, so that was not the problem. I learned photography. So eventually, my first husband and I got a divorce. Our children went to a very top boarding school in England because my first husband worked between London and Paris, and we decided, since I was traveling a lot, this would be the best condition for our children to study in. Today, um, my older son runs the world's foremost LASIK vision clinic. He was voted by his peers the world's foremost LASIK eye surgeon. His clinic is in London, London Vision Clinic. My younger son's third major film, Mrs. Harris Goes to Paris, is opening worldwide this Friday in Los Angeles and London and everywhere else. It's a fabulous film. His first film, Skin, won 22 awards. So despite the fact that my kids grew up in their teens, went to a school in London, in boarding school, I think they did pretty well. And I want to show you the last picture. I had published 24 books. And could you show that picture, please? And the books were from all over the world. Hello? Yeah. No, no, there. Okay. My first book was called Making Love Work, and I co-authored it with a psychologist. These books, these three books, I did with my second husband in Indonesia. I was working in Indonesia for 10 years. This book is a romance book that sold over 100,000 copies and was Book of the Month in Australia. It's called Skyriders, and it's actually based on my experience of flying food into flooded regions of Ethiopia. These books my husband and I did together, and they're called Photographing London, Paris, Amsterdam. There are 6 of them or 8 of them, of different cities, how to photograph in those cities. This is a book called the Travel Photographer's Handbook, where my husband and I taught at UCLA, and even after my second husband passed away, I was continuing to teach there and was voted Best Instructor of the Year. And it's a photography book on how to go around the world taking pictures, as good a picture as you can make it. And this book is one of my favorites. Uh, Made it in China, and it's called Adventure in Splendid China, and it was commissioned by a Chinese organization. And again, it sold about 80,000 copies in China alone. And there was a theme park in America, in Florida, called Splendid China. And my husband and I were commissioned to create something for the opening of the theme park in Florida. And this was the book we created.
Erika,
And
we should probably bring it to a close, but
that's it.
okay, thank you so much.
But I want to say one last thing, okay? In closing, I didn't have an easy life. And I never became rich doing all these books, but I had a lot of fun doing them. And what I want to leave you with, and this is something I tell students when I give talks, is that the thing that made my life worth living was that I chose professions where I was happy working. So it wasn't the money, it was the joy of working that made my life exceptionally worthwhile for me. And that's what I want to leave you with.
Thank you so much. Thank you.